You drink it every morning, but you've never heard this story. A single bean crashed empires, built Wall Street, and created the first global drug cartel. For most of human history, Europe stumbled through life in an alcoholic haze. Peasant and prince alike reached for beer and wine because water carried disease. By noon, most of the population was drunk. Then, a black, bitter drink arrived from the Islamic world, and everything changed. The alehouse gave way to the coffeehouse. Commercial contracts spiked. Insurance markets formed. Scientific societies emerged overnight. Jonathan's coffeehouse became the London Stock Exchange. Lloyd's coffeehouse became Lloyd's of London. Sedation gave way to calculation. But here's what they don't teach you. The same drink that built modern capitalism is now being grown in labs by scientists without a single bean. And 25 million farmers may become obsolete. This is the story of the world's most dangerous drug, hidden in your morning cup. This is the coffee capital, the ritual economy. Long before coffee traded on Wall Street, long before it became a morning ritual for billions, the bean served a completely different purpose. As a military ration in the Ethiopian highlands, Oromo warriors developed the world's first coffee product, calling it energy balls. The process involved harvesting ripe coffee cherries, crushing them in stone mortars, and mixing the paste with clarified butter from their cattle. Rolled into spheres about the size of billiard balls and stored in leather pouches, these rations sustained entire military campaigns. Each ingredient in these coffee balls served a specific function, engineered for warfare. Caffeine provided central nervous system stimulation, suppressing fatigue and increasing alertness. Ghee delivered dense caloric energy at 9 calories per gram for slow-release fuel across rugged terrain. Sugars from the coffee pulp gave an immediate glucose spike, and the fat sealed everything from oxidation, allowing storage for weeks without spoilage. European explorers like James Bruce and missionaries like J. Lewis Craft documented Oromo warriors surviving on these balls for days without other food. And that tells you something about coffee's original value. It wasn't about enjoyment, but function. Sustenance for combat rather than pleasure at breakfast. The slaughtered coffee. Nutrition only tells part of the story, because coffee also held sacred power in Oromo society. Within Wakefana, the indigenous Oromo religion, coffee grows from the tears of the sky god, Wak, making the bean a divine gift rather than a mere plant. And the terminology reflects this reverence. Oromo don't cook coffee, they sacrifice it. Buna kala, which literally translates to slaughtered coffee, involves boiling whole dried coffee cherries in butter with salt and spices, and biting the cherry to break its skin carries the same ritual weight as cutting the throat of a sacrificial animal. This linguistic equivalence endowed the coffee bean with the same spiritual value as livestock, the primary measure of wealth in Oromo society. Conflict resolution, marriage negotiations, and child naming all required the Buna Kala ceremony. Warring factions, or negotiating families who shared slaughtered coffee, created a binding social contract, lowering transaction costs in a society without courts or written law. Coffee purchased something money couldn't: peace or alliance. The logistics of the highlands. The Great Rift Valley and the arid Somali lowlands isolated the wild coffee belt of Kaffa from the Red Sea coast, demanding a logistical triumph over geography to move beans from forest to port. The supply chain broke into three segments. Extraction came first, as human porters and donkeys carried wild gathered coffee from forest to village markets across 3 to 12 miles, or 5 to 20 kilometers. Muslim highland merchants then handled aggregation, transporting coffee from village markets to the city of Harar across 185 to 310 miles, or 300 to 500 kilometers. And finally came export, as Somali camel caravans carried the processed coffee from Harar through scorching desert to the ports of Zayla and Berbera, another 155 to 185 miles, or 250 to 300 kilometers. None of this trade moved on coin. It moved on salt. Amole, bars of rock salt mined in the Danakil Depression, served as the primary medium of exchange in the Ethiopian interior for over a millennium, and value increased with distance from the mines. Near the Danakil, one amole might purchase a large quantity of grain, but in the highlands of Kaffa, far from the source, salt became precious enough that a donkey load of coffee exchanged for a specific number of these bars. Harar marked the point where the wild economy of the forest met the commercial economy of the Islamic world. Merchants processed the coffee there, drying cherries in the sun to reduce moisture content by over 60%, which cut transport weight for the arduous camel journey to the coast. The camel economics. Somali clans monopolized the link between the Ethiopian highlands and the Red Sea, with the camel serving as the only viable transport across the arid Haud and coastal plains. A single camel could carry 2 heavy sacks of coffee, roughly 330 to 440 pounds, or 150 to 200 kilograms. But what drove costs wasn't the animal, it was protection. Under the Aban system, every caravan hired a protector from the local clan whose territory it crossed, with safety coming in exchange for a fee, usually paid in cloth, dates, or a portion of the cargo. At Zayla and Berbera, the Adal sultans levied additional duties on outgoing caravans, targeting coffee as a high-value, low-bulk commodity. Ideal for taxation. From Zayla, coffee crossed Bab el-Mandeb Straits, the Gate of Tears, to the Yemeni ports of Mocha and Aden on dhows, sewn plank ships capable of navigating the coral reefs. And monsoon winds governed everything. Coffee harvested in Ethiopia in late autumn would be dried and transported to catch the winter winds to Yemen, and this seasonality created boom and bust cycles in the markets of Mocha, where merchants waited months for the Abyssinian fleet to arrive. The Sufi transformation. The 15th century brought coffee's most radical transformation in Yemen, from a solid food to a liquid sacrament, with Sufi mystics driving this shift. For the Shadaliya order, dhikr, the ceaseless remembrance of God, stood at the center of practice, and their night vigil, or qiyam al-layl, demanded hours of chanting, rhythmic breathing, and meditation. The primary obstacle to this spiritual labor was biological, because sleep represented not just physical fatigue, but spiritual failing, a barrier between the mystic and the divine. Sufi sheikhs like Jamal al-Din al-Dabani, the Mufti of Aden who died in 1470, legitimized coffee by framing it as a tool for worship. By suppressing adenosine receptors, coffee prevented sleep and induced what the Sufis called markaha, a state of spiritual intoxication. Wine clouded the mind and was forbidden. Coffee sharpened the mind and was permitted. Dervishes passed a large bowl of coffee from hand to hand during communal rituals, chanting, La ilaha illallah. There is no God but God. Abd al-Qadir al-Jaziri, the 16th century scholar, documented these practices in his manuscript Umdat al-Safwa, the first historical treatise dedicated entirely to coffee, which remains the definitive primary source on early coffee history. Mocha's own Sufi saint, Ali ibn Omar al-Shadili, became the patron saint of coffee growers, with his tomb drawing pilgrims and linking coffee irrevocably to the spiritual realm. What this meant for the market was simple. Coffee's value derived from prayer productivity, and demand became inelastic, meaning it didn't drop when prices rose, because the Sufis needed coffee to fulfill their religious obligations. This created the first stable, non-seasonal demand for the commodity, independent of harvest fluctuations. From husk to bean. Before roasting became the global standard, Yemenis developed an earlier drink called kishir, or husk tea. Dried cherries arriving from Ethiopia still carried fruit pulp attached or easily separated, and brewing the husk required no heavy grinding or roasting equipment. Sweet, lightly caffeinated, and warming, kishir proved ideal for cool Yemeni nights while utilizing the entire coffee cherry. And even today, it remains more popular in rural Yemen than bean coffee, reflecting the deep historical roots of the people's drink, while the bean became an export commodity. Roasting the seed likely developed to intensify the stimulant effect, or preserve the commodity longer. And kahwa, originally a poetic word for dark wine, came to mean the dark brew of roasted beans. For the Sufis, this process held symbolic weight, as a green bean subjected to fire transformed into something aromatic and potent, mirroring the Sufis' own transformation through spiritual discipline. The Agricultural Revolution. By the late 14th or early 15th century, demand from Sufi circles outstripped the inconsistent supply of wild coffee from Ethiopia, necessitating a shift from extraction to production. Yemen became the world's first coffee laboratory. Haraz, Bani Matar, and Rema in the Yemeni highlands offered altitude above 6,500 feet, or 2,000 meters, similar to the forests of Kaffa. But Yemen lacked rainfall, and monumental hydroengineering provided the solution. Farmers carved step-like terraces into the sheer cliffs of the Sarawat Mountains, terraces that arrested soil erosion while capturing the meager rainfall. And complex systems of cisterns and channels diverted seasonal floodwaters from the wadis, the dry riverbeds, up to these terraces. Coffee transformed from a zero-input wild plant into a high-input, high-capital crop. This shift massively increased the cost of coffee, which now embodied the labor of stone masonry, the maintenance of irrigation, and the risk of drought, all of which justified a higher market price compared to wild Ethiopian beans. Waqf capitalism. Capital-intensive agriculture needed financing, and Islamic Waqf, the religious endowment, provided the answer. Wealthy merchants, sultans, or pious individuals would donate land or the revenue from a farm to a religious cause, in this case, the Sufi monastery called a khanqa. Specific coffee terraces were designated as waqf for the tomb of a saint, such as Sheikh al-Shadili in Mocha, with the harvest dedicated solely to supplying dervishes with coffee for their vigils. Because waqf property could not be sold or taxed, these coffee farms enjoyed protected legal status, and this stability allowed for long-term investment in tree maintenance and terrace repair, creating the backbone of the Yemeni coffee economy. The biological lock. Yemeni cultivation succeeded beyond expectations, and the rulers realized they possessed a global monopoly, which they protected through what might be called a biological lock. Fertile berries could not leave the port of Mocha, and all beans destined for export were dipped in boiling water or partially roasted to kill the seed's ability to sprout, with port authorities maintaining strict scrutiny over caravans and ships. Nearly 2 centuries passed before Dutch smuggling operations in the 1600s finally cracked this biological lock. And until then, the world had no choice but to buy exclusively Yemeni coffee. The 1511 ban, coffee's expansion from the sacred to the secular sphere, triggered a moral panic. Khair Beg, the Mamluk governor of Mecca, observed men drinking coffee in the mosque courtyard in 1511, and they were not just praying, they were socializing. What had been a ritual economy was leaking into a leisure economy. Jurists were summoned, and physicians argued that coffee was cold and dry, according to Galenic medicine, the ancient Greek medical theory that still dominated, and potentially harmful, while conservative clerics likened the gatherings to wine taverns. Coffee was banned as an intoxicant, with stocks burning in the streets of Mecca. The Sultan in Cairo overturned the ban because Sufi lobbying proved powerful, and tax revenue from the coffee trade had grown too significant to sacrifice, providing the theological cover that allowed the trade to continue. Istanbul opened its first coffee houses in 1554, marking the end of the ritual economy's dominance. Demand for coffee was no longer limited to mystics, as it became the beverage of the urban intellectual, the merchant, and the courtier. Coffee houses replaced the monastery as the primary site of consumption, and this secularization exploded the volume of trade, turning the port of Mocha into a global brand. The Ottoman monopoly. Conquering Mamluk Egypt in 1517 and seizing the Yemeni coast in 1538 put the Ottomans in control of the entire global supply of a commodity rapidly gaining popularity across the Islamic world. Portuguese circumnavigation of Africa had disrupted the Asian spice trade, hemorrhaging value from the Red Sea route that once funneled pepper and cloves to the Mediterranean. But coffee offered something different. Unlike spices grown in distant Southeast Asian archipelagos beyond Ottoman control, coffee was indigenous to the Ottoman sphere of influence, and revenue from this domestic monopoly could replace lost customs duties while subsidizing the massive cost of maintaining a Red Sea fleet. Özdemir Pasha, the Ottoman governor in the 1540s and 1550s, is credited with formally introducing the beverage to the court of Suleiman the Magnificent in Istanbul. His patronage transformed coffee from a provincial habit into an imperial fashion, creating the demand shock that would drive the Yemeni economy for the next century. The Mocha tax machine. Ottoman administrative fiat transformed Mocha from a negligible fishing village into a global emporium, and by the 17th century, the city had developed a distinct urban layout dedicated to trade, dominated by the Furda Customs House, the Governor's Palace, and the Wakalas, the fortified warehouses. Administering Mocha became a high-stakes game of profit extraction, with every camel caravan arriving from the interior entering through the Bab al-Shadili, the land gate, where loads were weighed at the government kapan, the official scales, and the internal transit tax was levied. What merchants called the Mocha tax was not a single line item, but a cumulative burden. Internal transit duty of 2 to 3%, kapan weighing fee of 1 to 2%, usher tithe of 10%, Harbi duty of 5 to 9% applied to non-Muslim merchants, and the Mazdaria, a fixed fee per bale that often served as the governor's personal income. By the time a bale of coffee left the port, approximately 20 to 30% of its value had been extracted by the state apparatus. Coffee taxes represented 20 to 35% of the Yemen eyalet's total revenue, funding the Ottoman military presence in southern Arabia. The Banyan Paradox. Perhaps the most striking feature of the Ottoman coffee monopoly was its reliance on non-Muslim finance. Banyans, Hindu merchants from Gujarat, dominated Mocha as its financial class. Operating as sarafs, money changers and bankers, Banyans understood the complex exchange rates between the Indian rupee, Spanish real, Venetian ducat, and Ottoman para, and more. Importantly, they provided the credit that lubricated the trade. Yemeni farmers needed advances to harvest crops. Ottoman tax farmers needed loans to pay auction fees, and the Banyans supplied this liquidity. Strict Islamic law classified polytheists, those who worship multiple gods, like Hindus, as lacking the status of people of the book, which theoretically granted them fewer rights. But Ottoman pragmatism prevailed. Banyans received protected status, wore distinct dress, and even maintained a temple in their compound, because they were indispensable. As one observer noted, the Banyan is the key to the treasury. Through their hawala system, bills of exchange that connected Mocha to Surat, Bombay, and Basra, the Banyans allowed Ottomans to remit revenues to Istanbul via the Indian Ocean trade network, bypassing dangerous overland routes when necessary. Standard currency in Mocha wasn't the Ottoman akçe, but the Mocha dollar, pegged to the Spanish real de a ocho, the piece of 8. And this silver coin, minted in the Americas, integrated Yemen into the global silver economy. The Cairo Syndicate, merchant princes known as the Tujar, controlled the logistics of the northward trade. Owning the massive dhows of the Red Sea fleet, they coordinated ship arrivals at Mocha to manipulate prices, and in the Great Khans, the trading houses of Cairo, they stored coffee as a buffer against erratic Yemeni supply, absorbing the risk of shipwrecks and Bedouin raids in exchange for enormous profits. Hajj pilgrim caravans also played a crucial role. These massive operations, sometimes consisting of 20,000 to 40,000 camels, funneled through Mecca and Medina. On the return leg, pilgrims loaded their camels with coffee beans from markets near the holy cities, and the coffee of the Hajj was seen as blessed, which is how these pilgrims introduced the habit of coffee drinking to the remotest corners of Anatolia, the Balkans, and Persia. The Coffee House Revolution. Istanbul's first coffee house opened in 1554 or 1555, and it proved more revolutionary than any military conquest. Two Syrian entrepreneurs, Hakam from Aleppo and Shams from Damascus, established their shop in Tatakale, a district strategically located between the main port of Eminonu and the Grand Bazaar. And their location was deliberate. Tatakale served as the neck of the commercial city, where goods from the Mediterranean docked and flowed into the markets. By planting their flag here, Hakam and Shams positioned the coffee house as the filtration system for the empire's commercial intelligence. Design of the coffee house followed a deliberate logic. The cedar, a raised platform with cushions, lined the perimeter and forced patrons to sit shoulder to shoulder, facing inward, creating a theater in the round where everyone watched everyone else. At the center, the ochak hearth, where coffee was prepared, put the craftsmanship of the kahvechi on display, and the open meydan space was left for performers, traveling dervishes, poets, and the Meda, the professional storyteller. Pre-coffee Ottoman cities had left a significant vacuum because no secular public space existed for voluntary association outside the structures of kinship, prayer, or immediate commerce. Mosques served ritual purposes, the bazaar existed for transactions, and the home remained private, which meant there was no third place where a merchant could converse with a scholar or a soldier with a craftsman without specific transactional purpose. Coffeehouses filled that void. The entry price of a few akçe for a cup of coffee was low enough to be accessible to artisans and soldiers, yet attracting literati, poets, and men of letters. For the price of a cup, an illiterate boatman could sit in the same room as a qadi, a judge, or a poet, listening to poetry readings, discussions of state affairs, or recitations of history. Coffeehouses became educational institutions where the curriculum was the world itself. By the 17th century, approximately 2,500 coffeehouses operated in Istanbul alone. The conquest of the night. Perhaps the most profound economic impact of the coffeehouse was temporal, because pre-modern Ottoman society operated on a solar cycle where labor began at dawn and ended at dusk, leaving the night dark, dangerous, and economically dead. Coffee shattered this circadian constraint. Francesco Morosini, the Venetian ambassador, writing in 1585, observed with bewilderment that the Turks drank this black liquid, boiling as hot as they can stand it, and that it had the property of keeping a man awake. This wakefulness created a second shift in the urban economy. Negotiations that could not be completed in the chaotic bustle of the day were moved to coffeehouses in the evening, and chemically induced alertness allowed for complex mental labor like accounting, letter writing, and strategic planning to occur after the physical labor of the day was done. For the guilds, coffeehouses extended the time available for socialization and solidarity. Craftsmen's coffeehouses became nocturnal headquarters where disputes were settled and apprenticeships arranged outside shop hours. An employer looking for a master builder did not need to traverse the city. He simply went to the specific coffeehouse, known to be frequented by masons, interviewed potential hires, checked references with other patrons, and struck a deal over a cup of coffee. Search costs of labor dropped dramatically. The information exchange. Information in the 16th century traveled at the speed of a horse or a sail, and information asymmetry, where one party knows more than another, drove profits in trade. A merchant who knew that plague had hit the silkworms in Bursa could make a fortune in Istanbul before the news became public. Coffeehouses leveled this asymmetry, functioning as the world's first information exchange, a slower, oral version of a Bloomberg terminal. Traders arriving from the Red Sea brought news of the coffee harvest in Yemen, and this news percolated through the coffeehouses of Cairo before traveling by ship to Istanbul's Tahtakale. Hours after a ship docked, prices of coffee, spices, and slaves adjusted based on coffeehouse chatter. Two key archetypes facilitated the transmission of intelligence: the Meda, the storyteller, and the traveler. The Meda, while ostensibly telling tales from 1001 Nights, was a master of subtext, who would weave local gossip, political satire, and news into his performance. A story about a corrupt vizier in ancient Baghdad was understood by the audience to be a critique of the current official in Istanbul. Travelers served as the lifeblood of the coffeehouse news cycle, because strangers entering a coffeehouse received a place of honor, but were expected to pay for their coffee with news from the road. Is the pass at Bolu open? Are the Safavids mobilizing? This interrogation ritual turned every coffeehouse into a localized news bureau. The Janissary banking system. Within the coffeehouse, the most sophisticated financial engine belonged to the Janissary Corps. By the 17th century, Janissaries had transformed from a sequestered military elite into a commercial class, deeply embedded in society. Each Janissary regiment maintained a central fund called the Orta Sandug. Originally a benevolent fund for funerals and sickness, it evolved into a powerful investment bank, with the Orta lending money to merchants, tax farmers, and even the state at high interest rates, disguised as profit-sharing or service fees. Janissary-owned coffeehouses were the physical locations where these loans were negotiated and dispersed. A trader needing capital for a venture to the Balkans would approach the Janissary officers in their coffeehouse, smoke a pipe, and negotiate a loan from the Orta chest. Efficiency came coupled with brutality, as Janissaries could enforce repayment through the threat of violence, bypassing the courts entirely. From prohibition to taxation. Ottoman coffeehouse history is punctuated by state attempts to close them, most notably under Sultan Murad IV, who reigned from 1623 to 1640. Murad's ban was total, with coffeehouses demolished and tobacco smokers executed. Ungovernable speech terrified the state, and in a time of Janissary unrest and weak sultans, coffeehouses appeared as breeding grounds for rebellion. The bans proved a fiscal disaster. Customs tax on coffee imports was a significant revenue stream, and banning consumption depressed demand, lowering receipts. Policing the ban required a massive apparatus of spies and patrols, draining the treasury rather than filling it. Like prohibition in the United States, Ottoman bans created a thriving underground economy. Moved shops into private homes and into secluded gardens, operating by paying bribes to local officials and Janissary patrols. This shifted revenue from the state treasury to the pockets of corrupt officials. Futility of prohibition became undeniable, because demand for coffee and the social space of the coffeehouse was inelastic. People would pay any price. Khatib Chelebi, the polymath, a scholar of many subjects, provided intellectual cover, arguing in his treatise The Balance of Truth that coffee was not explicitly forbidden by the Quran, and that censorship should not intrude into private habits, which allowed strategy to shift from eradication to monetization. Taxes targeting the coffee trade specifically were introduced, including customs duties at the ports, license fees on coffeehouses, and innovation taxes on non-canonical goods. And by the 18th century, these levies had grown substantial enough that the state realized it was more profitable to have 2,500 taxable coffeehouses than 0 banned ones. Tax collection was outsourced through the Malikane system, life-term tax farming, where wealthy individuals bought the right to collect taxes for a district. The right to collect taxes on coffeehouses in a specific district was auctioned to the highest bidder, often high-ranking pashas or wealthy Janissary officers. This integration of the ruling elite into the success of the coffeehouse meant that a pasha who owned the tax farm for coffeehouses wanted them full and profitable. The era of bans effectively ended, because political elites now had a direct financial stake in the survival of the coffeehouse. Poachers had become gamekeepers. The mercantilist dilemma. For the Lord's 17, the Heron 17, the 17 men who governed the Dutch East India Company, reliance on mocha was economically intolerable. Mercantilist theory, the dominant economic paradigm of the era, posited that national wealth was maximized by accumulating gold and silver bullion and minimizing imports. Purchasing coffee at Mocha required exporting silver coins, a direct drain on the Dutch Republic's treasury. And trade ledgers of the late 17th century reveal growing anxiety over this outflow of precious metals. Market volatility at Mocha meant the VOC could not predict procurement costs from one season to the next, and competition came from the English and the French, with the company dealing with Ottoman tax collectors, local brokers, and the powerful merchant syndicates of the Red Sea. Buy price fluctuated wildly based on harvest conditions, political instability, and competitive bidding. A simple calculus drove the decision. If the Dutch could transplant the crop to a territory where they controlled the land and labor, they could convert the volatile purchase price into a fixed, low operational cost, stopping the leakage of silver to the Ottomans, and undercutting European rivals who remained dependent on the Red Sea trade. The first breach. Breaking the Ottoman monopoly was not a singular event, but a decades-long process of intelligence gathering, botanical experimentation, and coordinated smuggling. Peter van den Broeke, a senior VOC merchant tasked with establishing trade relations in the Red Sea, orchestrated the first documented theft of live Coffea arabica in 1616. Van den Broeke utilized his diplomatic status to bypass standard inspections at the Mocha port, and his target was not merely seeds, which could easily dry out or be sterilized, but live bushes, whole plants capable of immediate propagation. Extraction involved transporting these plants aboard a VOC vessel bound for Amsterdam, a treacherous journey of several months. Plants had to survive the scorching heat of the Red Sea, the storms of the Cape of Good Hope, and the cooler climates of the North Atlantic before arriving alive in the Netherlands, where they were transferred to the Hortus Botanicus, Amsterdam's famous botanical garden, and thrived in the controlled environment of a greenhouse. While Dutch climate was wholly unsuitable for commercial agriculture, this operation proved a critical concept. Coffea arabica could survive a sea voyage and cultivation outside of Arabia, providing the VOC with its first breeding stock, a genetic bank from which future colonial ambitions could be launched. The Malabar Bridge. Before the Dutch industrialized coffee theft, an Indian Sufi pilgrim had already broken the biological monopoly. Around 1600, Baba Budan smuggled 7 fertile coffee seeds from Yemen to India, strapping them to his chest to conceal them from Ottoman guards, and transporting them to the hills of Chikmagalur in Mysore. These seeds established a small, localized cultivation culture in the Malabar region. Baba Budan's actions broke the biological monopoly, but not the commercial one. Coffee grown in India remained a local commodity. But presence of these naturalized coffee bushes in India provided the Dutch with a secondary, less guarded source of genetic material, forming the Malabar Bridge that would prove invaluable when direct extraction from Yemen became too difficult. The architect of botanical imperialism. Pieter van den Broeke demonstrated feasibility, but Nicolaas Witsen, mayor of Amsterdam and a formidable VOC administrator, orchestrated the industrial transfer. Witsen embodied the prototypical figure of the Dutch Golden Age, serving as statesman, scholar with deep interests in cartography and botany, and corporate director with the power to mobilize fleets, all while viewing botany as a branch of statecraft. In 1696, Witsen issued direct, confidential orders to Adrian van Omen, the VOC commander in Malabar. His directive was clear: secure coffee seeds, either from the progeny of Baba Budan's plants or from fresh stock smuggled from Arabia, and transfer them to the Dutch stronghold of Batavia in Java. This order marked the transition from botanical curiosity to industrial agricultural policy, and the consequences would reshape the global coffee market. Disaster and triumph. India's Malabar coast served as the critical staging ground for the VOC's coffee ambitions. Adrian van Omen, acting on Witsen's instructions, sourced seeds from the established populations in the Malabar Hills, descendants of the seeds brought by Baba Budan. Utilizing Malabar as the transshipment point, the VOC effectively bypassed the heightened security of the Red Sea, creating a triangular transfer of genetic material. Yemen to India to Indonesia. Plants from the first batch, shipped by van Omen, arrived in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, in 1696, and were planted on the private estate of Governor-General Willem van Outhoorn. But disaster followed. A massive flood, compounded by an earthquake, inundated the estate and destroyed the young saplings. Though the setback did not deter the VOC directors, Henricus Zwaardekroon oversaw the importation of a second batch of cuttings and seeds from Malabar in 1699, distributing them to new locations along the banks of the Ciliwung River. This second shipment became the biological patient zero for the Indonesian coffee industry. Plants survived, thrived in the volcanic soil of West Java, and began producing fruit. The Ceylon paradox. The VOC had attempted coffee cultivation in Ceylon before Java, and the experiment failed not because of agriculture, but because of policy. Having seized Ceylon from the Portuguese in 1658, primarily to control the cinnamon monopoly, the VOC bound cinnamon harvesting to the Salagama caste through compulsory labor. When coffee was introduced to the island, the administration saw it as a threat rather than an opportunity. Fearing that cultivating coffee would divert labor away from cinnamon peeling, and that plantations would encroach on wild cinnamon forests. Governor Gustav Willem Baron van Imhoff attempted to promote coffee and pepper cultivation in the 1750s to diversify the economy. But the Heren 17 in Amsterdam overruled him, ordering a halt to these exports to prevent competition with Java. Ceylon's coffee industry was strangled in the cradle to protect the interests of another colony. This corporate rigidity concentrated all coffee development in Java and inadvertently ensured that when coffee leaf rust devastated Ceylon a century later, it was the island's tea industry, not its coffee, that rose from the ruins. The Priangan system. To make Java coffee competitive against the established mocha trade, the VOC needed to produce it cheaply, and they achieved this through implementing the Priangerstelsel, the Priangan system, in the highlands of West Java. This system bypassed direct employment of farmers in favor of utilizing the existing feudal hierarchy, with treaties signed with local Javanese regents called bupatis, requiring them to deliver a fixed quota of coffee beans annually as a form of tribute. Two tiers of procurement defined the system. First were the contingent 10, a tax in kind where regents delivered a certain tonnage of coffee to the VOC as tribute, acknowledging Dutch sovereignty. For this portion of the crop, the VOC paid nothing, and the cost of production was borne entirely by the peasantry. Second were the verplichte leveranties, forced deliveries. Once the tribute quota was met, the VOC exercised its monopsony power, as the only buyer in town, to purchase the surplus, with the price for these deliveries fixed by the VOC in Batavia and set significantly below market rates. Payment from the VOC to the regents was approximately 3 to 4 Rijksdollars per pikul, about 10 guilders for 137 pounds or 62 kilograms of coffee. And that payment went to the regent, not the peasant. Regents deducted transport costs, commissions, and feudal dues before passing a fraction to the cultivator, which meant the peasant often received only 1 or 2 Rijksdollars, or payment in overvalued commodities like cloth or salt. Amsterdam auctions saw Java coffee commanding prices between half a guilder and 3 guilders per pound, and at a conservative average of 1 guilder per pound, a pickle of 125 pounds generated revenue of 125 guilders. Gross profit margin exceeded 1,150% on forced deliveries. And on the contingenton, where the VOC paid nothing, the margin was effectively infinite. The zero-wage model. The Priangerstelsel financialized feudal labor obligations. Each peasant household, called a kakka, owed labor service to their lord, and the VOC converted this traditional obligation into commodity production. Each kakka was required to plant, maintain, and harvest a specific number of coffee trees. In the 1720s, a household might be responsible for 200 to 500 trees, but by the late 18th century, quotas frequently exceeded 1,000 trees per family. This required mobilization of the entire family unit, with men conscripted for heavy labor like clearing forests and transporting harvests, while women and children picked and processed. To ensure compliance, the VOC introduced the coffee sergeant, a European or Eurasian subordinate who resided in the highlands. His duties included inspecting coffee gardens, estimating harvest yields, and overseeing the transfer of coffee to warehouses. Acting as the eyes of the VOC, the coffee sergeant ensured that the labor extracted by the regent was directed efficiently toward the company's export targets. The tipping point. Vertical integration, controlling the entire supply chain from farm to sale, delivered immediate and devastating economic impact on the Yemeni trade. First commercial export of Javanese coffee, just 894 pounds, arrived in Amsterdam in 1711. And by 1721, mocha still dominated the market, with 90% of imports to Amsterdam. Then came a staggering reversal. Just 5 years later, in 1726, Java coffee accounted for 90% of Amsterdam's coffee imports. The Dutch had completely inverted the global coffee market within half a decade. Annual imports from Java exceeded 2 million pounds by 1726, and this flood of supply caused a dramatic drop in global prices, democratizing the beverage for the European middle class while securing immense profits for the company through volume rather than high unit margins. The cork of the empire. Moving millions of pounds of coffee from volcanic highlands to the coast required a logistical transformation of the Javanese landscape. The Citarum River became the primary artery, with the VOC establishing a transshipment hub at Chicao, where massive wooden warehouses received coffee transported from the Bandung Plateau. From there, flat-bottomed barges called praus carried the cargo downstream to the Java Sea. Coffee roads were mandated, cutting through dense tropical rainforest, and the steep gradients and muddy terrain took a catastrophic toll on water buffaloes, essential capital for rice farming. This depletion of animal capital compounded another crisis, the conflict between coffee and rice. Coffee harvest overlapped with the crucial period for harvesting or planting rice. Men conscripted to transport coffee to distant warehouses were absent for weeks, leaving irrigation systems neglected, and the Priangan region, ecologically fertile, often suffered from rice deficits. Using coffee profits to subsidize subsistence of the producers, the VOC had to import rice to feed the coffee workforce. By the second half of the 18th century, coffee had become the financial lifeline of the VOC. Historians call the Java coffee trade the cork upon which the entire company floated. But this cork floated on a sea of debt. Maintaining an 18% dividend to keep stock prices high, the company increasingly paid dividends from borrowed capital rather than net profits. This Ponzi dynamic collapsed with the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War of 1780 to 1784, when British blockades created a coffee mountain of rotting inventory in Batavia and no cash in Amsterdam. The VOC was nationalized in 1795 and dissolved on December 31, 1799, with debts of 134 million guilders. The Amsterdam Bourse. Coffee transformed from a physical commodity into a financial asset on the Amsterdam Bourse, the city's famous stock exchange. Sale of VOC goods was conducted using the bid de kaars method, by the candle. An auctioneer would announce a lot of coffee, and a small tallow candle was lit. Bidding was permitted only as long as the flame burned, and as the candle burned down, the frenzy increased. Whoever made the final bid before the flame extinguished won the lot, a ritual that forced traders to reveal their true valuation quickly. When coffee was offloaded into VOC or municipal warehouses, a receipt was issued to the depositor. These receipten, warehouse receipts, were bearer instruments, meaning whoever held the paper owned the coffee, decoupling the trading of value from the physical movement of heavy, perishable sacks. Receipten could be bought and sold multiple times a day. A receipt for 100 bales of Java coffee might change hands 10 times before the physical coffee was ever removed from the warehouse. And this liquidity allowed for the entry of speculators who had no intention of ever roasting a bean. Credit was the engine of this trading. Dutch financial markets developed the prolongatie, a form of short-term renewable loan secured by securities or commodities. A speculator wishing to buy 10,000 guilders worth of coffee receipts did not need 10,000 guilders. He might put down 20 to 30% of his own capital and borrow the rest, pledging the coffee receipts themselves as collateral. Remarkably low interest rates, often 3 to 4%, encouraged massive leverage. Trading in the wind. Windhandel, trading in the wind, was the pejorative term applied to trade in non-existent shares and commodities. Yet it represented the birth of modern derivatives. Traders bought opties, call and put options, giving them the right to buy or sell coffee at a future date for a fixed price. Forward contracts allowed merchants to sell coffee to arrive on the next fleet at a fixed price, a bet on the future spot price. If the fleet was lost or the harvest failed, the spot price would skyrocket, and the seller would be ruined. Conversely, if the fleet was massive, the seller would pocket the difference. Senior VOC directors and the Heeren 17 practiced what today would be criminal insider trading. They had prior access to the Generale Missiven, the general reports from the Governor-General in Batavia, and this information arrived 6 to 8 months before the coffee ships. Private intelligence of a crop failure in the Priangan allowed them to buy up coffee receipten, or call, options on the Bourse before the news was made public. If prices were too low, they could withhold stock in the massive Oost-Indisch House warehouses, releasing it only when scarcity drove prices back to target levels. The French heist. VOC financial dominance relied on its biological monopoly. As long as the Dutch controlled the genetic stock of high-yield coffee, they could dictate global prices. A single plant, not a fleet, broke this monopoly. A rare strategic misstep in 1714 saw Mayor of Amsterdam Nicolaas Witsen gift a healthy coffee tree from the Hortus Botanicus to King Louis XIV of France. A diplomatic gesture that proved to be a catastrophic error. Gabriel de Clieu, a French naval officer, acquired a cutting from the king's plant in 1720. His voyage to Martinique became legendary, as he reportedly shared his meager water ration with the seedling to keep it alive during a crossing through the doldrums, that windless zone near the equator where sailing ships could be stranded for weeks. That single cutting spread rapidly to the French Caribbean colonies, most notably Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti. And by 1789, Saint-Domingue produced nearly 60% of the world's coffee. Driven by intense exploitation of enslaved African labor and closer proximity to European markets, the French plantation system undercut Dutch prices. When the Amsterdam Bourse began listing West Indian coffee alongside Java and Mocha, it signaled the end of the VOC's monolithic control. The genetic bottleneck. The VOC's heist created a critical biological vulnerability that persists today. The vast majority of Coffea arabica grown outside of Ethiopia and Yemen descends from the handful of seeds smuggled by Baba Budan and the single noble tree lineage from Java. The global coffee crop suffers from an extreme genetic bottleneck. Lack of genetic diversity created a monoculture with no natural resistance to pests or disease. And in 1869, coffee leaf rust fungus appeared in Ceylon. Within 20 years, it had decimated the island's coffee plantations, reducing exports from 100 million pounds to near zero, and forcing the transition to tea. Disease also ravaged Java, forcing the Dutch to abandon the vulnerable Arabica in lower elevations. They replaced it with Coffea canephora robusta, a hardier, more bitter species discovered in the Congo, which explains why Indonesia today is primarily a Robusta producer. Genetic uniformity, engineered by the VOC's espionage, effectively built a global industry on a foundation of biological sand, the implications of which are still being fought by agricultural scientists dealing with climate change and new disease strains. Paper coffee. The credit crisis of 1772 to 1773 revealed the fragility of paper coffee. Beginning in London with the collapse of a banking house that had speculated in East India Company stock, the crisis triggered a liquidity panic that crossed the North Sea to Amsterdam. The prestigious Amsterdam house of Clifford & Sons, a central pillar of the prolongati market, failed. As Clifford collapsed, other lenders panicked and called in their prolongati loans. Speculators holding coffee reception on margin were forced to sell immediately to repay their debts, and this cascade of margin calls drove prices into the floor. With credit frozen, merchants could not finance new inventory. Demand at VOC auctions evaporated. The price of coffee on the Amsterdam Bourse plummeted, and over 40 coffeehouses in Amsterdam that had acted as unregulated betting parlors for the wind handle were forced to close. This crisis coincided with the glut of coffee from Saint-Domingue, and the VOC's ability to manage prices was gone. Paradoxically, the Haitian Revolution would later savage the global supply, removing 60% overnight and sending prices skyrocketing. The VOC itself would not survive much longer. The company was nationalized in 1795 by the Batavian Republic, a French client state, and formally dissolved on December 31, 1799, with the Dutch state assuming approximately 134 million guilders in debt. What the state inherited as its most valuable asset was the coffee-producing machinery of the Priangan. The transition. By the late 18th century, the Portuguese colony of Brazil faced an economic crisis. The gold cycle of Minas Gerais, which had financed opulent Baroque architecture and filled the coffers of Lisbon, was in terminal decline, as the gold deposits in the riverbeds that had sparked the world's first great gold rush were exhausted. Simultaneously, the sugar economy of the Northeast faced stiffening competition from modernized Caribbean plantations and the emerging beet sugar industry in Europe. Brazil needed a new engine of growth, and coffee offered the answer. The statistical transformation proved stark. In 1800, Brazil's coffee exports totaled a mere 1,720 pounds, but by 1820, exports had surged to 12.9 million pounds, and by 1840, the figure had exploded to 137.3 million pounds. Coffee accounted for 41.4% of total exports by the 1840s, rising to over 60% by the end of the century. Exponential growth fundamentally realigned the geopolitical axis of Brazil. For 3 centuries, the Northeast, Bahia and Pernambuco, had been the center of gravity, holding the majority of the population, wealth, and political influence. Coffee pulled the center of power southward to the provinces of Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and Minas Gerais. The forest rent, a geological depression running parallel to the Atlantic coast, the Paraíba Valley possessed a singular combination of factors that allowed it to outcompete established global producers like Java and Haiti. Economists call the primary advantage the forest rent. Dense Atlantic forest grew on deep, iron-rich soils that were naturally acidic, mirroring conditions of the Ethiopian highlands where Coffea arabica originated. Clearing and burning this forest provided a massive, albeit temporary, injection of nutrients into the soil through the resulting ash, allowing Brazilian planters to achieve stratospheric initial yields without capital expenditure on fertilizers or the labor-intensive terracing required in Java. Climate patterns acted as a silent partner. Receiving 47 to 63 inches, or 1,200 to 1,600 millimeters of rainfall annually, concentrated in the growing months, the valley experienced a reliable dry season during harvest. This distinct dry window allowed for development of open-air drying patios, a low-tech, low-cost processing method, while producers in wetter zones had to invest in expensive mechanical drying infrastructure. A slash-and-burn mentality characterized Brazil's model. Planters did not view the land as a permanent asset to be stewarded, but as a consumable resource. Coffee plantations would advance westward into the forest, exhaust the soil within 20 to 30 years, and then move on, leaving behind degraded pasture land. This lack of stewardship was an economic strategy, because land acquired through seizure or nominally priced grants cost less than soil conservation. Brazilian overproduction had bottomed out global coffee prices by the 1840s, rendering the more labor-intensive production of Java less competitive. Brazil did not win on quality. It won on a ruthless calculus of volume, fueled by the consumption of 2 non-renewable resources, the Atlantic forest and the lives of enslaved Africans. Human collateral. Interpreting 19th-century Brazilian slavery merely as a labor system misses its financial utility. Within the bank-poor, cash-short economy of the empire, enslaved people functioned as liquid capital. the primary unit of account, a store of value more reliable than the fluctuating currency, and the essential collateral for credit. Roughly 2 million Africans were imported to Brazil between 1800 and 1850, with the vast majority destined for the coffee zones of the southeast. Mass importation wasn't just for labor, it was speculative investment. Planters purchased human futures, betting that the labor output of the enslaved over time would exceed the cost of acquisition and maintenance. Investigations into the ledgers of the Banco do Brasil and the British-owned London and Brazilian Bank reveal the extent to which the financial sector was entangled with the slave barracks. Enslaved people were routinely mortgaged to secure loans for land expansion, machinery, or lifestyle consumption. Despite Britain's public anti-slavery stance, British capital was deeply complicit. Records show the bank holding mortgages on plantations where the primary security was the enslaved workforce, and, in one instance, a £150,000 credit line was secured by 800 enslaved people. When planters defaulted, banks exercised their right to liquidate the collateral. The case of the Baron of Turvo in 1869 is illustrative. Upon his default, the bank forced the public auction of 103 human beings, and families were separated to maximize the auction price of prime working-age males. Risk of coffee farming was literally borne by the bodies of the enslaved under this system. If a crop failed or prices dropped, the debt was settled by selling human beings. The return on investment. Plantation ledgers and census data from the 1840s allow us to reconstruct the cold mathematics of the coffee plantation. A healthy male slave cost between 350,000 and 450,000 milreis, while maintenance costs remained extremely low, approximately 30,000 to 50,000 milreis per year. Planters often allocated marginal plots for slaves to grow their own food, externalizing the cost of reproduction. A single worker could tend 2,000 to 3,000 trees, producing roughly 1,650 to 2,640 pounds, or 750 to 1,200 kilograms of coffee annually. At market prices, gross revenue per slave reached 200,000 to 300,000 milreis. Deducting maintenance and factoring in mortality risks, the payback period for an enslaved worker was approximately 4 to 5 years. Annual return on investment approached 50%, and in 2 years, the enslaved worker had paid for himself and generated pure profit thereafter. This ROI, far exceeding the 5 to 8% returns typical of European industrial investments, explains the ferocity with which the coffee elite defended the slave trade. The enslaved worker was a hyper-productive asset, and this surplus value was the capital that built the mansions of Açores and the boulevards of Rio de Janeiro. The coffee barons. Coffee boom wealth crystallized into a new social class, the barões do café, the coffee barons. Unlike the hereditary nobility of Europe, this was a meritocracy of capital, with merchants, slave traders, and successful mule train operators laundering their money into land and slaves, purchasing titles from the emperor to legitimize their status. And by 1889, Brazil had 316 barons, the vast majority deriving their wealth from coffee. Symbiotic relationships connected the coffee aristocracy and the imperial court. Planters provided the tax revenue via export duties on coffee and import duties on slaves and goods that funded the state. In return, the state provided the apparatus of force necessary to maintain slavery, and the legal apparatus to secure their property. Coffee revenue stabilized the reign of Dom Pedro II, It funded the suppression of regional revolts, the war against Paraguay, and the modernization of urban Rio. Though personally intellectual and ambivalent about slavery, the emperor served as the figurehead of a state that was, in essence, a committee for managing the common affairs of the coffee bourgeoisie. Concentration of wealth in the hands of the coffee barons created islands of European luxury in the midst of the tropical frontier. Joaquim José de Sousa Breves, known as the King of Coffee, owned over 20 plantations and an estimated 6,000 slaves. And his power was such that he openly defied British naval patrols, smuggling Africans onto his estates through his private port at Marambaya, long after the trade was illegal. Francisco Paulo de Almeida, the Baron of Guaraciaba, complicates the racial narrative. A black man who rose to become one of the wealthiest bankers and planters in the empire, owning the Yellow Palace in Petropolis and over 1,000 slaves. His success demonstrates that while the system was racially stratified, money whitened in the eyes of the imperial elite. Many of these estates were built on land acquired through grillagem, a specific technique of document forgery. Planters would fabricate titles, backdating them to the colonial era, then place these fresh documents in a box with live crickets. Insect excrement and chewing would rapidly age the paper, giving it the yellowed, frayed appearance of a centuries-old deed. And this fraud was laundered into legitimate property rights by a judiciary dominated by the same planter class. The mule train economy. The Paraíba Valley is separated from the port of Rio de Janeiro by the Serra do Mar, a formidable coastal mountain range. And before railroads arrived in the 1850s, the only link between production zones and the global market was the mule train. Moving millions of pounds of coffee over narrow, muddy mountain trails required staggering logistics. An estimated 20% of the entire male slave force in the coffee region was dedicated to the transport sector, managing mules, loading cargo, and maintaining trails. A single mule could carry 2 sacks of coffee, roughly 265 pounds, or 120 kilograms total, and a tropa might consist of 50 to 100 mules, requiring a team of enslaved tropeiros to manage. The journey from a plantation in the interior to the port could take weeks. Transport via mule accounted for up to 1/3 of the final export price of the coffee. This massive overhead acted as tax on production, while exposure to rain, sweat, and rough handling during the journey degraded the beans, cementing Brazil's reputation as a producer of volume rather than quality coffee, and forcing it to compete on price. Saturation of the mule trails by the late 1840s, where convoys would be stuck in mud for days, creating traffic jams of beasts and cargo, created the irresistible economic pressure that led to railway construction. British capital built the São Paulo Railway between 1860 and 1867, a project representing the pinnacle of 19th-century engineering that overcame a near-vertical escarpment rising 2,600 feet, or 800 meters, in just a few miles. To attract London investors, the imperial government utilized a powerful financial instrument, a guaranteed 7% annual return on invested capital. This converted equity risk into quasi-sovereign debt risk, ensuring dividends, regardless of initial traffic volume. A privileged zone, about 19 miles or 31 kilometers on each side of the track, created a legal monopoly, funneling all freight onto the single line. Engineer Daniel Mackinson Fox proposed a radical solution, a system of inclined planes utilizing stationary steam engines and cables, the Cerveia system. At the top of each of the 4 inclines, with gradients of 1 in 9.75, approximately 10%, powerful 1,000 horsepower stationary steam engines hauled continuous steel wire ropes. Downward-moving trains loaded with heavy coffee helped pull up upward-moving trains loaded with coal, manufactured goods, and immigrants, while the steam engines provided additional force to overcome friction and weight differentials. Railways transformed the economics of coffee, reducing travel time from the plateau to the port from weeks to hours, and dropping the cost per ton precipitously. The São Paulo Railway operated at such immense profitability that it became known as the sucking pump for the wealth of São Paulo. Dividends to British shareholders became legendary in London, and the Inglesa, as it was called, became the physical manifestation of British informal imperialism, control not of the territory, but of the critical choke point of its economy. British capital that built the railway did not merely build a track. It built the artery that kept the heart of the Brazilian economy beating. The labor transition. When the transatlantic slave trade ceased in 1850, it delivered a demographic shock that fundamentally altered the cost structure of Brazilian agriculture. Prior to 1850, labor supply was maintained through the importation of Africans, but ending the trade capped the total supply, transforming slaves into a dwindling, appreciating asset. Price of an adult male slave skyrocketed from approximately 400,000 milreis in the early 1850s to over 1 million milreis by the 1880s, a 500% increase that squeezed profit margins. The Colonial system emerged in the 1880s as a hybrid industrial agricultural contract designed to replace slavery with subsidized European immigration. 3 distinct revenue streams comprised Colonial contracts for the immigrant family. First, a fixed annual monetary payment for the maintenance of a specific number of coffee trees. Second, a piece rate payment based on the volume of coffee berries harvested. And third, permission to plant subsistence crops between the coffee rows, which reduced the planter's cash outlay for food to near zero and allowed the colonos to reproduce their labor independently. By the 1880s, the cost of acquiring and maintaining a slave exceeded the cost of employing free labor, provided that transport was subsidized by the state. The Sociedade de Promotora de Imigração, founded in 1886, operated a comprehensive, vertically integrated logistics chain, recruiting agents in Italy, fully subsidized transatlantic passage, and reception facilities in São Paulo. The Hospedaria dos Imigrantes, the massive processing center built in 1887, served as a transitional way station where Italian families were matched to coffee plantations requiring labor. Between 1886 and the early 20th century, this system imported hundreds of thousands of Italian families, with the subsidy paid specifically by the province's coffee revenue. Coffee exports generated tax revenue. The province transferred funds to the Immigration Society. The society imported Italian labor. New labor allowed for expansion of coffee plantations and increased production, generated more tax revenue. Beyond economics, this immigration policy also carried an ideological dimension known as branqueamento, or whitening. The Brazilian regime explicitly favored desirable European immigrants to shift the racial composition of the population after abolition, with Italian and Portuguese immigrants preferred precisely because they would whiten the workforce. When slaves left the plantations in May 1888 with the abolition of slavery, Italians were effectively walking in the other door, and the labor crisis was mitigated by transport abundance. Railways allowed for rapid movement of this new labor force to the interior, and even more rapid movement of the crop they produced to the coast. Global hegemony. The empire of coffee had achieved its primary objective by 1850, global market dominance. Brazil produced over 2 million bags annually, accounting for roughly 50% of the world's supply. Dominance came through driving prices down. Rio-grade coffee, though considered inferior to Java or Mocha, was affordable. And this democratized coffee consumption in Europe and the United States, transforming it from a luxury good into a daily necessity for the industrial worker. Brazil did not just enter the market, it expanded the market by lowering the entry price. Brazil's rise was inextricably linked to the rise of the United States. As the U.S. removed tariffs on coffee in the 1830s, demand surged. By 1850, the U.S. had become the largest importer of Brazilian coffee, with American industrial workers fueled by Brazilian coffee, and Brazilian coffee planters fueled by the American market. The supercrop. The dawn of the 20th century presented the global economy with a paradox of plenty. In the red-earthed plantations of São Paulo, coffee trees, millions of which had been planted during the speculative frenzies of the preceding decade, reached maturity in unison. Financial turbulence lay at the roots of the crisis. The period known as the ensilamento, Brazil's speculative bubble of the 1890s, was characterized by wild credit expansion, inflation, and currency devaluation. And for coffee planters, a depreciating currency was initially a boon. They sold coffee for hard currency on the international market, but paid local labor and debts in depreciated paper mil-réis. This socialization of losses through inflation encouraged a speculative planting boom in the 1890s. Because coffee trees require 4 to 5 years to mature and bear fruit, market signals are always delayed. Trees planted during the easy credit years began coming online simultaneously in the early 1900s, and in 1902, the looming surplus was already visible, leading São Paulo to enact a prohibitive tax on new coffee planting, a desperate attempt to close the barn door after the horse had bolted. The 1906 crop was a biological phenomenon, where nearly every tree in the Terra Roxa, the famous red earth of São Paulo, bore fruit at maximum capacity. Early forecasts suggested 16 million bags, but as the harvest commenced, it became clear the number would exceed 20 million from Brazil alone. World consumption hovered around 17 million bags, and the surplus of 7 million bags, combined with carryover stocks, threatened to push prices effectively to zero, or at least far below the cost of production. For the coffee barons who controlled the state governments of São Paulo, Minas Gerais, and Rio de Janeiro, this was an existential threat. A collapse in coffee prices would not only bankrupt the planters, but also destroy the banking system holding their mortgages, and the railroads depending on coffee freight tariffs. The entire macroeconomic structure of southeastern Brazil was leveraged on the price of coffee. The Taubaté Agreement, presidents of the 3 principal coffee-producing states convened in the town of Taubaté, São Paulo, on February 26, 1906, responding to the impending catastrophe. The resulting Convênio de Taubaté was a revolutionary document, outlining a comprehensive plan for state intervention in the market. Commitments included maintaining a minimum price in the domestic market of 55 to 65 gold francs per bag and prohibiting the export of coffee inferior to type number 7. The aim was reducing total volume and improving the reputation of the Brazilian brand by keeping low-grade coffee off the international market. The agreement also established a permanent service to promote coffee consumption globally, develop new markets, and combat fraud, while imposing prohibitive taxes on planting new coffee trees for 2 years. Most critically, It authorized the state of São Paulo to contract loans up to £15 million to fund the purchase of the surplus. A surtax of 3 francs per bag of coffee exported was created, with revenue specifically earmarked to pay the interest and amortization of the loans used to buy the surplus. Planters were, in effect, taxing their own exports to finance their own bailout. The Coffee King. Taubaté Agreement ambitions required capital on a scale that exceeded the fiscal capacity of the Brazilian states. To withdraw 8 to 10 million bags of coffee from the market, roughly half of the world's annual consumption, São Paulo needed approximately 15 to 20 million pounds. When approached, the House of Rothschild declines to finance the scheme. Their rationale was grounded in conservative banking orthodoxy. They believed artificial price supports would only encourage more production, leading to a larger crash in the future. They viewed the scheme as speculative gambling rather than sound finance. This rejection created a vacuum filled by Hermann Sielken, the German-born senior partner of the New York firm Crossman and Sielken. Sielken was the dominant figure in the U.S. coffee trade, known as the Coffee King. Unlike the Rothschilds, he was a merchant banker who understood the physical commodities trade intimately. He recognized that if financing could be secured to hold the coffee for several years, inelastic demand would eventually force prices up. Sielken famously dictated the terms of the rescue to the Paulista envoys. He demanded total control, with the syndicate rather than the government controlling sales of the stockpiled coffee. He demanded offshore storage, with coffee shipped out of Brazil to neutral warehouses in New York, Hamburg, Le Havre, and Antwerp, to prevent local political pressure from forcing premature sales. And he demanded high commissions on every bag bought, stored, and sold. The syndicate, Sielken assembled a coalition of banks willing to share the risk, creating a transnational network of capital. J. Henry Schroeder and Company, a merchant bank with deep ties to German trade and the Hamburg coffee market, became Sielken's primary European partner. The National City Bank of New York, now Citibank, marked a significant moment in financial history. The entry of U.S. banking capital into South American sovereign debt, challenging British dominance. Société Générale represented French capital, crucial because France was a major creditor to Brazil and a large consumer of coffee. And they were joined by the Banque de Paris et des Pays-Bas, which had extensive experience in issuing sovereign debt. 3 critical stages marked the financing. In August 1906, a £1 million bridge loan from the Brasilianische Bank started immediate purchases in Santos. And in December 1906, a £3 million syndicate loan, secured by the surtax and the coffee stock itself, allowed Sielken to accelerate buying. December 1908 marked the turning point. With a new president in power, one sympathetic to the planters, the federal government put its sovereign guarantee, the full faith and credit of the nation, behind the operation. And a £15 million consolidation loan allowed the syndicate to bond the debt over 10 years, giving the Valorization Committee the time horizon needed to wait out the market. The Great Hoarding. Execution of the valorization was a logistical feat that transformed the global coffee supply chain, involving the physical removal of a massive percentage of the world's supply from the marketplace. Agents of the São Paulo government entered the market at Santos daily throughout the 1906 to 1907 harvest, buying whenever the price dipped below the agreed minimum. And by the end of the campaign, the government had purchased approximately 8.4 million bags of coffee, representing nearly 40% of the entire world crop for that year. Sielken's insistence on shipping the coffee abroad was crucial. If coffee remained in Santos, local planters would pressure the government to sell it during the next harvest to free up warehouse space. But by moving it to the northern hemisphere, the coffee was placed under the legal custody of the banking syndicate. At the peak, New York held over 900,000 bags of valorization coffee in warehouses on the Brooklyn waterfront. Millions more were stored in Hamburg's Speicherstadt, its famous warehouse district, at Le Havre, in Antwerp, and in London. A valorization committee, often referred to as the Committee of Seven, was established to manage the stockpile, with representatives from the participating banks and the state government meeting in London and Paris to decide exactly how much coffee to release and at what price. Their strategy was simple: starve the market. They announced that government stocks would not be sold at market prices, but would be held until a target price was reached, forcing roasters to bid up the limited, free coffee available from private planters. The corner works. Hoarding produced an effect that was slow but inexorable. In 1906 and 1907, prices remained depressed due to the sheer visibility of the surplus. But as the syndicate locked the warehouse doors and the 1908 and 1909 crops proved smaller, partly due to the planting bans and natural cycles, the market tightened. Coffee averaged 7.5 cents per pound in 1905, dropped to around 6 cents during the crisis of 1906 to 1908, and by 1910, as shortage appeared and the syndicate controlled the release, prices had risen to 9.5 cents. Prices reached 13.5 cents by 1911, more than double the lows, and by 1912, coffee peaked at 14 cents per pound. The syndicate began selling portions of the stockpile at huge profits, using the proceeds to pay down the £15 million loan ahead of schedule. Financially speaking, the operation was a spectacular success. Consumers bore the cost of this success, with the price increase costing the United States public approximately $57 million per year, and the breakfast table tax, as it was disparagingly called, became a focal point for anger against the Coffee Trust. The antitrust battle. Valorization scheme's success inevitably drew the ire of the United States, which consumed roughly 40% of the world's coffee and 80% of Brazil's exports. Senator George Norris introduced a resolution in the U.S. Senate in 1911 as coffee prices peaked, demanding an investigation into the high price of coffee. This coincided with the broader Pujo Committee hearings investigating the money trust, the concentration of financial power in Wall Street, and Herman Sielken, with his dual role as a merchant and a financier connected to National City Bank, became a prime target. In May 1912, Attorney General George Wickersham filed a lawsuit in the District Court for the Southern District of New York against Herman Sielken, Bruno Schroeder, and the other members of the Valorization Committee. The government argued that the Valorization Committee constituted a combination in restraint of trade and a conspiracy to monopolize the coffee market, in direct violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Seeking a preliminary injunction to prevent the coffee from being moved, the U.S. government petitioned for the forfeiture and seizure of the 950,000 bags of valorization coffee then stored in New York. A major diplomatic incident followed, with the Brazilian ambassador lodging a formal protest, arguing that the coffee was the property of the state of São Paulo, a sovereign entity, and was therefore immune from the jurisdiction of U.S. courts. Despite the strong legal defense, the risk of having the coffee seized was too great for the financiers. In 1913, a settlement was reached where the Valorization Committee agreed to sell the entire stock of coffee held in New York to bona fide dealers by April 1913. In exchange, the U.S. Department of Justice agreed to dismiss the lawsuit. While the U.S. government claimed a victory for the consumer, the syndicate essentially won. They sold the coffee at the prevailing market price, which was still high due to the successful corner, and repatriated the profits. Silkin purportedly remarked that the U.S. government had simply acted as his sales agent, forcing him to take profits at the top of the market. The addiction to intervention. The 1906 valorization was hailed in Brazil as a triumph of economic statecraft. It had saved the planter class, stabilized the currency, and asserted Brazil's power in the global market. But the apparent success created a trap, a moral hazard where success rewarded the very risky behavior that caused the crisis and institutionalized overproduction and dependency. Success created a political expectation that the state would always intervene to protect coffee prices. The government was forced to intervene again in 1917 due to World War I shipping blockades, and again in 1921 following a post-war crash. Each intervention grew larger than the last, requiring more foreign debt. São Paulo established the Institute for the Permanent Defense of Coffee in 1924. Price support was no longer an emergency measure, but a permanent function of the state. The Institute built massive warehouses in the interior to hold the surplus indefinitely, funded by a revolving door of foreign loans. Artificially high prices provided a price umbrella for other nations. Colombia, Central America, and African colonies began to expand their coffee production, knowing that Brazil would shoulder the burden of restricting supply to keep prices high, and Brazil's market share, which was near 80% in 1906, began a slow, long-term decline as competitors entered the market. The music stops. The system relied on a continuous inflow of foreign credit to finance the stockpiles, and when the Wall Street crash of October 1929 froze global credit markets, the music stopped. Borrowing to buy the surplus became impossible for the Institute, and prices collapsed from 22 cents in 1929 to 8 cents in 1931. Inventory of withheld coffee had grown to gargantuan proportions, over 20 million bags sitting in warehouses across Brazil. Valorization system breakdown contributed to the collapse of the old republic and the revolution of 1930, which brought Getúlio Vargas to power. Vargas inherited a bankrupt state and a mountain of unsellable coffee. His solution was drastic: physical destruction of the surplus. Between 1931 and 1944, the National Coffee Department burned or dumped into the sea 78.2 million bags of coffee, a quantity equal to 3 years of global consumption. Initially, sacks were cut open and dumped into the sea off the port of Santos, but the beans floated back to shore, rotting on the beaches and creating a public health hazard. The department switched to incineration, mixing coffee with tar and kerosene and firing it in giant pyres. In a surreal twist of economic desperation, coffee beans were even used as fuel for steam locomotives, with the São Paulo Railway running trains powered by the very commodity they were transporting, because coffee was cheaper than imported coal. Smoke rising from the burning coffee piles, while Brazilians went hungry and the world struggled through the Great Depression, represented the grotesque endpoint of a market intervention gone mad. The great coffee hoarding of 1906 saved the oligarchy of the Belle Époque, the Gilded Age before World War I, but it constructed the engine of debt and surplus that drove the Brazilian economy off a cliff in 1929. Coffee, as containment. In the grand theater of the Cold War, a less visible but equally critical struggle was waged through the mechanics of international trade. Among commodities that fueled the global economy, none possessed the geopolitical potency of green coffee. Coffee represented far more for the United States than a caffeinated beverage essential to the American way of life. It was the economic lifeblood of Latin America, the primary source of foreign exchange for over a dozen nations in the Western Hemisphere, and the fragile barrier standing between fragile republics and the perceived abyss of Soviet communism. Economic indicators alone cannot explain the genesis of the 1962 International Coffee Agreement. It was born of profound political fear. Cuba's revolution of 1959 marked the decisive turning point. The fall of the Batista regime and Fidel Castro's subsequent alignment with the Soviet Union sent shockwaves through the U.S. foreign policy establishment. Washington feared that plummeting commodity prices would drive other Latin American nations, specifically Brazil and Colombia, the two largest producers, toward radical social revolution. The Kennedy administration viewed Latin America as the critical theater for Cold War containment. Only weeks after his inauguration, President John F. Kennedy proclaimed the Alliance for Progress, envisioned as a Marshall Plan for Latin America, a 10-year, multi-billion-dollar program aiming to foster economic cooperation, land reform, and democratic governance. Administration officials quickly realized, however, that direct financial aid would be insufficient if the underlying terms of trade remained unfavorable. A collapse in coffee prices would wipe out the benefits of financial aid faster than Congress could appropriate funds, because every cent dropped from the price of coffee represented millions of dollars in lost foreign exchange for Brazil and Colombia. Coffee price stabilization thus became a mechanism of indirect aid, a way to transfer capital to Latin American elites and rural populations without the direct appropriation of congressional funds. Effectively taxing the American coffee drinker to subsidize the Latin American coffee grower. The International Coffee Agreement of 1962 was a complex diplomatic instrument involving 58 nations, 32 exporting countries accounting for 95% of world exports, and 22 importing countries accounting for 90% of world imports. The agreement established the International Coffee Organization, headquartered in London, to administer the treaty and supervise the market mechanisms. Export quotas served as the central regulatory instrument. At the beginning of each coffee year, the ICO Council determined a global export quota based on estimated world demand, and this global pie was then sliced into basic quotas for each exporting member. The system operated through an indicator price mechanism, a composite average of the daily prices of the principal groups of coffee. If the indicator price fell below the agreed target floor, export quotas were automatically cut, with this reduction in supply theoretically forcing prices back up. If prices rose above the ceiling, quotas were increased to flood the market and cool down prices. A cartel is only as strong as its ability to prevent cheating, and the ICA solved this through a rigorous bureaucratic mechanism involving coffee export stamps. The ICO issued stamps to exporting members corresponding strictly to their quarterly quota allocation, and every bag of coffee exported to a member importing country had to be accompanied by a certificate of origin affixed with these stamps. Customs authorities in importing member nations were treaty-bound to reject any shipment lacking these stamps. This system effectively closed the major markets to non-quota coffee, transforming the customs agencies of the consuming nations into the enforcement arm of the producing nations. The wealth transfer. Economic historians widely regard the ICA as one of the most successful commodity agreements in history, and between 1963 and 1989, with intermittent interruptions, it succeeded in keeping coffee prices relatively high and stable. Quantitative analysis suggests that the ICA raised prices by approximately 73 to 75% above the theoretical market price without the cartel, resulting in an annual transfer of wealth from consuming nations to exporting nations estimated at $8 to $12 billion in inflation-adjusted terms. To put this in perspective, the total value of the Alliance for Progress aid package was $20 billion over 10 years. The ICA transferred nearly that amount annually in coffee rents during its peak operation. A massive, decentralized foreign aid program, funded directly by the American consumer at the supermarket checkout. The tourist coffee paradox. Quota systems successfully controlled exports to member countries, but exports to non-members were unrestricted. This non-quota market included the Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc nations, and countries with historically low coffee consumption. A structural loophole created a two-tier market, with the quota market featuring high prices protected by the US and Western Europe, while the non-quota market offered discounted prices, 30 to 50% lower. Producing countries, burdened with surplus stock that exceeded their ICO quotas, faced a choice: destroy the coffee or sell it to non-members at whatever price they could get. And they chose the latter. This phenomenon became known as tourist coffee, coffee shipped to non-member countries. A profound geopolitical irony emerged. The United States had established the ICA to stabilize Latin America against Soviet influence, but the mechanism of the ICA compelled Latin American producers to sell their excess inventory to the Soviet Union and its satellites at effectively subsidized rates. American consumers paid premium prices to support Latin American economies, while the Soviet Union enjoyed high-quality coffee at a steep discount. The Juan Valdez factor. While the ICA provided a floor, Colombia deployed a second strategy to capture even more value: ingredient branding. Global coffee markets were engaged in a penny war by the late 1950s. Only 4% of U.S. consumers were aware that Colombia produced coffee, and as roasters blended Colombian beans with cheaper varieties, the distinct premium quality of the Colombian profile was being diluted, dragging the price down toward the commodity average. The National Federation of Coffee Growers of Colombia hired Doyle Dane Bernbach in 1958, the Madison Avenue agency famous for the Think Small Volkswagen campaign. And the brief was audacious: persuade the American housewife that a specific ingredient in a blended product was worth paying a premium for. Hard financial logic drove the creation of the Juan Valdez character in 1959. The FNC needed to tangibly represent the value proposition of Colombian coffee, that it was grown at high altitudes, on volcanic soil, and, crucially, hand-picked only when ripe. Juan Valdez, with his mule Conchita and the backdrop of the Andes, visually distinguished Colombian coffee from the mechanized plantation-style production of Brazil. Imagery of hand-picking emphasized the labor-intensive nature of the product, justifying a higher marginal cost, and the narrative educated consumers that good coffee takes time and effort. The seal of approval. Functioning as more than a trademark, the triangular 100% Colombian coffee logo served as a licensed financial asset. For a roaster to display this logo on their can or bag, they had to enter into a licensing agreement with the FNC. Coffee inside the package had to be 100% Colombian Arabica as the most fundamental requirement, and blends were strictly prohibited from using the logo, which forced roasters to segregate their supply chains and commit to volume purchases of Colombian origin. Explicit financial logic underlay the strategy. If the consumer demands the ingredient, the manufacturer loses the power of substitution. Roasters can no longer silently swap Colombian beans for cheaper Mexican or Brazilian beans without risking consumer backlash. Between 1960 and 1990, the FNC invested $1.3 billion in marketing Colombian coffee. And in the 1990s alone, premiums raised specifically attributable to the Juan Valdez advertising amounted to $1.6 billion. 5 months after the campaign launch, 60% of surveyed consumers expressed a willingness to pay more for Colombian coffee. By 2001, the 100% Colombian logo had an identification rate of 85% in the U.S., surpassing global megabrands like Nike. Colombian prices decoupled from the generic exchange price through the Colombia Premium. Colombian milds always traded at a positive differential, typically 10 to 20% to the New York C price. The 1989 collapse. By 1989, the geopolitical landscape had shifted dramatically. The Soviet Union was in retreat, the Berlin Wall was on the verge of falling, and the threat of communist takeover in Latin America had diminished compared to the existential anxieties of the 1960s. The political tax that the U.S. government was willing to impose on its consumers became harder to justify. The U.S. insisted on 2 non-negotiable conditions for renewing: the agreement an end to tourist coffee by bringing all coffee sales under the quota system, and a redistribution of quotas to favor mild Arabicas at the expense of Brazilian unwashed and African Robustas. Brazil refused to budge. And on July 4, 1989, negotiations collapsed. The ICO suspended export quotas, and the free market returned to coffee for the first time in nearly 3 decades. Immediate and devastating effects followed. Without the restraint of quotas, producers dumped their accumulated stocks onto the market, and the ICO composite indicator price fell from an average of $1.34 per pound to 77 cents per pound in the 5 years following the collapse. In nominal terms, the price plummeted to 45 to 50 cents per pound, the lowest in a century. The human cost. ICA dissolution had tragic repercussions, nowhere more extreme than in Rwanda. Rwanda's economy was a coffee monoculture, with coffee accounting for nearly 80% of its export earnings. And under the ICA, Rwanda's coffee revenue was predictable, supporting the regime and funding the basic operations of the government. Sharp economic contraction coincided with the 1989 collapse. Export earnings collapsed from $144 million to roughly $30 million. The Habyarimana regime lost the patronage resources it used to maintain political control, and to manage the crisis, Rwanda was forced into structural adjustment programs, austerity measures required by international lenders, which required devaluing the currency and cutting social services. Economic desperation exacerbated historical ethnic tensions. Hutu elites, facing a shrinking economic pie and the loss of legitimacy, redirected popular anger toward the Tutsi minority. The collapse of the coffee economy created a pool of unemployed, desperate young men who were easily recruited by militias. And while the genocide had deep historical and colonial roots, the speed and intensity of the state collapse that facilitated the 1994 slaughter were catalyzed by the obliteration of the coffee economy following the end of the quota system. In Colombia, the price crash weakened the FNC's ability to guarantee purchase prices. Poverty in the coffee-growing regions increased significantly, and the Federation was forced to cut its staff by 60% and drastically reduce its services. With coffee no longer a viable livelihood, many farmers in marginal areas turned to the only crop that offered a guaranteed market and high price: coca. Weakening of the FNC's institutional presence left a vacuum filled by illegal armed groups, and the breakdown of the ICA thus indirectly fueled the intensification of the Colombian internal armed conflict. The Vietnamese juggernaut. ICA quota systems had effectively restricted the entry of new major producers, and once quotas were removed, the market was open to anyone who could produce cheaply. Vietnam, recovering from war and encouraged by World Bank development loans, massively expanded its production of Robusta coffee. Vietnam went from being a negligible producer in 1990 to the world's second largest producer by 2000, surpassing Colombia. This flood of cheap Vietnamese Robusta caused a structural oversupply in the global market, depressing prices for all producers, particularly the African Robusta growers who could not compete with Vietnam's efficiency. The ICA had been a dam holding back a flood. When the dam broke, the waters did not merely irrigate the valley of the free market, they drowned the villages below. The first wave: coffee as fuel. Understanding the magnitude of the shift that defined modern coffee requires first examining the first wave that dominated the United States after World War II. During this era, coffee was treated primarily as fuel, a delivery mechanism for caffeine. Dominated by mass-market brands such as Folgers, Maxwell House, and Nescafé, the market prioritized shelf life, consistency, and low cost over flavor profile or origin transparency. First-wave coffee was a loss leader or a staple grocery item, with the consumer relationship to the product purely functional. Brands competed almost exclusively on price and convenience, leading to the proliferation of vacuum-sealed tins and instant granules. Coffee shops were largely diners or donut shops where coffee was sold for cents or provided with endless free refills, with no differentiation between a bean from Colombia and a bean from Vietnam, because it was simply coffee. This meant the industry was strictly bound to the commodity market price, leaving roasters and retailers vulnerable to frost in Brazil or geopolitical instability in coffee-growing regions. First-wave consumption was characterized by passivity. Purchase decisions were made in the supermarket aisle, often driven by coupons or television advertising jingles, rather than palate preference. The Milan Epiphany. Howard Schultz joined Starbucks as the Director of Retail Operations and Marketing in 1982. And the pivotal moment occurred in 1983 when Schultz traveled to Milan, Italy, for an international housewares show. Milan revealed a coffee culture fundamentally different from the American model. Schultz saw 1,500 coffee bars in a single city, places that were not merely retail shops, but centers of social life. And he observed baristas working with speed and flair, greeting customers by name, and serving espresso beverages consumed standing up at the bar. Three critical components of the Italian model were missing in the U.S., as Schultz identified. First, the beverage itself was the draw, with Italians buying the finished product rather than beans to take home. Second, the coffee bar served as a social anchor between home and work, what sociologists call the third place. Third, the noise of the machine, the steam, and the interaction with the barista created a sensory experience that justified a premium price. Original Starbucks founders rejected his vision, so Schultz left to found his own company, Il Giornale. Funding proved nearly impossible to secure, with Schultz rejected by 217 of the 242 investors he approached. A high-risk venture attempting to introduce a foreign consumption ritual to a market satisfied with 50-cent diner coffee. Schultz acquired Starbucks in 1987, merged it with Il Giornale, and began an aggressive expansion that would define the 1990s. At the time of the merger, the combined entity had fewer than 20 stores. The economics of the latte. Starbucks' financial model genius lay in decoupling retail pricing from the cost of goods sold, specifically the green coffee commodity price. First-wave dynamics meant that if the price of green coffee spiked due to frost in Brazil, Folgers had to raise prices, and consumers would revolt or switch brands. Starbucks, however, was selling an experience and a milk-based beverage. Actual coffee content in a latte being a single shot of espresso, approximately 7 to 9 grams of ground coffee, while the rest was milk and foam. When coffee prices crashed in 1992 to 49 cents per pound, a historic low, Starbucks maintained and eventually increased its retail prices. Cost of the coffee beans in a $3 latte was often less than 10 cents, and the margin was protected by the value add of the milk, the syrup, the cup, and the real estate. Frappuccino introduction in 1995 was a watershed moment for unit economics. The blended ice drink used less coffee, more ice, which is free, and high-margin syrups, transforming Starbucks from a morning destination to an all-day destination. Starbucks went public on NASDAQ in 1992, raising $25 million earmarked almost exclusively for expansion. At the time, the company had only 165 stores, but by 2000, it had over 3,500 stores and $2.2 billion in revenue. By decoupling the price from the commodity, Starbucks proved that in the modern economy, the value is not in the product itself, but in the ritual of its consumption. The Third Wave Rebellion. Starbucks had been so successful by the late 1990s and early 2000s that it created a massive population of coffee drinkers who were now educated enough to demand something better, which birthed the third wave, represented by Blue Bottle, Stumptown, and Intelligentsia. Third Wave Rebellion reacted against the second wave. Where Starbucks was about consistency, dark roasts, and automation, the third wave was about nuance, light roasts, single-origin transparency, and manual brewing methods like pour-overs. Ironically, Starbucks made the third wave possible. They did the heavy lifting of educating the American palate away from instant coffee and Robusta blends, and normalized paying $3 to $4 for a cup of coffee. The third wave simply took that price point and applied it to a higher quality ingredient, stripping away the third-place comforts to focus entirely on the bean. Third-wave companies pay premiums of 200 to 400% above the commodity price for exceptional microlots. In the 2025 Best of Panama auction, a geisha varietal from Hacienda La Esmeralda sold for approximately $13,700 per pound, or $30,204 per kilogram. This is not a beverage price. It is an asset price. Coffee is undergoing winification, where specific farms, specific varietals, and specific processing methods command luxury goods valuations. The climate tax. A climate tax is now being levied across the entire coffee value chain. A systemic, compounding cost driven by extreme weather volatility, biological adaptation requirements, and financial hedging premiums that is violently restructuring the global industry. Central America's 2012 to 2013 coffee leaf rust epidemic provided a preview. The rust caused estimated damages exceeding $1 billion in Guatemala alone between 2012 and 2014. El Salvador saw production plummet 70% between the 2010-11 and 2013-14 seasons. Smallholder financial model fragility was exposed by the crisis. Guatemala, where 70 to 80% of coffee crops were infected, saw harvests on some plantations drop to 1/20th of historical yields. And the ICO estimated that 374,000 jobs were lost in Central America during the 2012-13 cycle alone. Employment collapse acted as a push factor for migration. Farmers and laborers, facing the destruction of their livelihood and lacking social safety nets, were displaced internally or crossed borders. Scientific consensus now projects a drastic reorganization of global coffee geography. By 2050, land area suitable for Arabica coffee cultivation is expected to decrease by approximately 50%. And Brazil's traditional coffee heartlands of Minas Gerais and São Paulo are projected to lose 70 to 75% of their suitable surface area. The coffee belt is not disappearing. It is moving upward in elevation and away from the equator, leaving behind a trail of stranded assets, farms that become worthless, and economic dislocation. The financialization of weather. Financial sector instruments have developed to price and transfer weather risk as physical risks mount. Starbucks, in a significant strategic shift, reduced its fixed-price hedge book from $1 billion in 2019 to under $200 million by 2024. And as Arabica futures surged 70% in a year, the cost of maintaining these hedge positions escalated. Starbucks moved toward price-to-be-fixed contracts that lock in supply volume and quality, but leave the price floating until a later date. The company is betting that it can manage spot market volatility better than it can pay the premiums for long-term certainty. At the retail level, volatility of the C price will increasingly pass through to the consumer. High-quality Arabica is becoming a luxury good, distinguished not just by flavor, but by the resilience of its origin, the lab-grown pivot. Decoupling coffee from the soil entirely represents the most radical response to the climate tax. Companies like Oromo and Compound Foods are developing molecular coffee, beverages that replicate the chemical signature of coffee without growing a single coffee plant. Using processes like bioreactor fermentation and synthetic chemistry, these startups aim to produce caffeine and the aromatic compounds that define coffee flavor without the biological constraints of the coffee tree. Oromo has raised nearly $60 million in venture capital funding, pivoting to a 50-50 beanless blend that mixes half traditional coffee with half molecular grounds. A strategy that lets roasters stretch their expensive green coffee supply while selling consumers on sustainability. In Finland, VTT Technical Research Center has grown coffee cells in bioreactors by suspending plant cells in nutrient broth inside steel tanks, multiplying them, then harvesting, drying, and roasting the biomass. Early batches reportedly taste between coffee and black tea, indicating that while the chemical precursors are present, The complex maturation inside a coffee cherry is difficult to replicate in vitro. Brazil's vast Cerrado Mineiro, meanwhile, shows land-based survivors automating. Self-propelled harvesters, like the Case IH Coffee Express, can process 60 bags per hour, operating 18 to 22 hours a day, with a single machine replacing over 100 manual pickers. Between 2007 and 2018, the number of temporary rural workers in the region declined by nearly 50%. The future of coffee is being built on one of two foundations: silicon or steel. For the 25 million smallholder families who depend on coffee cultivation in the global south, these technologies represent an existential threat. If Silicon Valley succeeds in decoupling caffeine from the soil, those farmers become economically obsolete overnight. This is the ultimate arbitrage, producing a coffee experience with zero exposure to weather, disease, or commodity price markets. The cycle of fragility. 500 years of coffee history has been traced, from a sacred ritual in Ethiopian highlands to a colonial engine of extraction to a Wall Street derivative, and finally to a laboratory experiment. At each stage, the pattern repeats. Value concentrates in the hands of a few, whether Ottoman governors, VOC shareholders, Brazilian barons, or American roasters, while risks and costs are externalized to the land and the laborers. Oromo warriors who first chewed coffee blended with butter could not have imagined that their energy ball would become a $200 billion industry. And Sufi mystics who brewed kawa to sustain their night vigils could not have foreseen that their spiritual technology would fuel the Industrial Revolution. Dutch smugglers did not merely steal a plant, they stole the future of Arabia and redistributed it to their colonial satellites. Americans did not merely buy coffee, they bought the geopolitical stability of an entire hemisphere, funded through the ritual of the breakfast table. The ghost in the machine. Coffee haunts the machine of the modern world. We did not just build our economy on a bean. We built it on the nervous energy of an entire species. Americans consume 9 pounds of coffee per person per year on average, totaling over 3 billion pounds nationally. And every morning, 150 million Americans begin their day with this ritual, a chemical sacrament that has become so ordinary we no longer see its strangeness. But the coffee plant does not care about quarterly earnings or central bank policies. It cares about temperature, rainfall, and the absence of rust. And those conditions are changing faster than at any point in coffee's 500-year commercial history. The vanishing world, that narrow band straddling the equator between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, the coffee belt, is shrinking. Ethiopian highlands, where coffee was born, are heating. The slopes of Guatemala, where the best Arabica grows, are being devoured by rust. And the terra roxa of Sao Paulo is drying. What replaces it? Perhaps the high plateaus of Tanzania, where the coffee frontier is migrating upward. Perhaps the laboratories of California, where fermentation tanks produce molecular facsimiles. Perhaps nothing at all. The future where coffee becomes what saffron is today, rare, expensive, and consumed only by the wealthy. Climate shifting and labs opening forces us to ask what we are really buying when we purchase a cup of coffee. Are we buying a drink, a ritual, or a drug? Or are we buying the last remains of a vanishing world? All of the above, I suspect, is the answer. That is the bitter aftertaste of the story we call coffee.